You're listening to WCOM LP 103.5 FM Carborough and Chapel Hill. It's a Tuesday, it's 5 o'clock, and that only means one thing. It's time for another round of Snarky Faith with your host, Stuart Deloney. This is a space where we irreverently wrestle through life, culture, and spirituality, all with our heads in the clouds, our tongues in our cheeks, our hearts in our sleeves, and our feet on the ground. At Snarky Faith, the questions or even the answers are never the point. It's all about the conversation. So here's your host, Stuart Deloney.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to another round of Snarky Faith Radio. I'm your host, Stuart Deloney, and I come to this show today with a heavy but not surprised heart. Over the weekend, we had another mass shooting in Texas in a church. Now, that makes 2 of the 5 deadliest shootings in modern history have happened just 35 days apart. And I'm left with this question, or really just this statement. What is it going to take for us to make a change in America? Because guess what, folks? Thoughts and prayers, they're not going to cut it. Isn't that our answer to everything? That's the president's answer to this latest shooting. That's the thing that you'll see smattered all over Facebook. Thoughts and prayers with Texas. Let's pray for Texas. And I've said this before, and I will say this again. If we have the ability as a country to be able to fix this problem, why do we need prayers? Like, why do we need thoughts and prayers in this situation that is preventable, a situation that we can fix? And no, we're not going to fix it in the way like the Texas State Attorney General has suggested. His answer, his name's Ken Paxton, he said this is going to happen again, and he's calling for more guns at church. Because, of course, the problem is we somehow don't have enough guns, and more guns equals more peace. The math, the logic is not, it's not there. It's not there. It's not there at all. I'm sorry, America. Your love of guns is going to kill you. Like, we are on this dangerous path where mass shootings have now kind of become like, another one happened? Okay. Type, thoughts and prayers. We've become used to it. We've become acclimated to it. And that's scary. That in fact is scary. That we have kind of just become, another day, another mass shooting. Well, that just happens. No, this should not be the new normal. This should not be what's happening. And when you have like a congregation where a gunman comes in, kills 26 people, and wounds 20 others, that is just shameful. And yes, was this guy stable? Was he a normal citizen? No, this guy's crazy. But that's not the point. And here's what the Texas Attorney General, Ken Paxton, is missing. More guns. That's not the answer. And when they were interviewing him, I mean, what he did is he brings out kind of this, NRA approach. And he said this. He said, the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And I just think that makes no sense. I don't want to see us being a country where we have armed security guards at schools, armed security guards at church. Really? At church? I mean, how does that gel? How does that gel with this whole idea of preaching Jesus, preaching peace, preaching love, preaching tolerance, preaching pacifism? Oh, all that's good and well, but I feel a lot safer with a gun. No, this makes sense. This is us operating out of an irrational and an illogical fear. And when we see people do this, when we see this becoming the new norm that we all just need to be armed, I feel like we're headed down a dangerous path. I really, really do. And so, no, my call for all of this is not more guns. I think we need more gun control, more regulation. Because I know there's people out there that'll say, I own guns and I'm not crazy. Well, that's great. That's great for you. But there is a significant amount of people that are unstable, that are incapable of making good, rational decisions. And they've got guns, they've got close carry permits. This is not the answer, America. This is not the answer. And especially to Christian America, to evangelicals. Really? So was Jesus packing heat when he was going around preaching? Because you never know what can happen when you're walking through Samaria. It's a dangerous place. Now, of course, I know. I understand they did not have gunpowder or ammunition or guns back in Jesus' day. But no, Jesus wasn't telling people to carry around swords or clubs just to make sure. He told people that they needed to be able to trust in God and walk in confidence of that. And that was it. Violence plus violence does not equal peace. It just doesn't. And that wasn't even the point of my show today. I just wanted to be able to bring that up at the top of the hour because I think it needs to be said again and again and again and again. America, we need gun control. I mean, we see this. We see the federal government. After the mass shooting in Las Vegas, they were all up in arms. Oh, we need to be able to ban bump stocks. Has it happened yet? No, it hasn't. No, it hasn't. But after we have a quote unquote terror attack in New York, simply it's called terror because the guy's skin was brown. Oh, now we need to talk about immigration. Oh, now we need to talk about the visa programs. Oh, the outrage is there from our president. But the mass shooting in Texas, where I think the president called him a bad guy. No, that guy's a terrorist. The guy in New York, a terrorist. The guy in Texas, a terrorist. Doesn't matter where you're from. When you are invoking terror upon people, when you are taking people's lives, when you are acting in a manner that is not in accordance with the law of society, that's a terrorist. That is simply what it is. And I just think that we have to move beyond this. That yes, people that inflict terror upon others' lives, regardless of their skin color, are a problem in our country. And yes, my firm belief is that yes, getting guns out of the hands of people is the answer. It's absolutely the only way to go. And without any kind of gun control, without any kind of reform, this is going to happen again and again. And we will continue as a culture to send our thoughts and prayers to these situations, and they will do nothing unless we take some sort of action. So let's put this in a little bit of perspective. And I got this from The Guardian. And I will let their own article speak for itself. It's an article called How Bad is U.S. Gun Violence? These charts show the scale of the problem by Mona Chambali. And when I read this part of the article, I was just like, what? But yes, I'll just go ahead and read this paragraph from her article. So comparisons can help us to understand the scale. Since 1969, when these figures were first collected, there have been 1,516,836 gun-related deaths on U.S. territories. Since the founding of the United States, there have been 1,396,733 war deaths. And that figure includes the lives lost during the Revolutionary War, the Mexican War, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, the First World War, the Second World War, Korean War, Vietnam War, the Gulf War, the Afghanistan War, the Iraq War, as well as other conflicts. So what we're looking at is this, is that Americans killed by guns since 1968 eclipse Americans killed by war. And when I begin to think about that, I'm just, my mind is boggled. Like I just continue just to shake my head over and over again. And then I stumbled on this article too. This is from CNN. That came out. Um, well, when you're listening to this, this is coming out on Monday, and it's in it. This is by Ed Stetzer, who is kind of a Christian church guru. And if you don't already know this show, me speaking in that voice means I'm going to skewer him. He wrote an article for CNN saying how Christians can respond to this latest church shooting. Which the funny thing here is the fact that we even have to say the latest church shooting. And Ed Stetzer, who's like a Lifeway Books guy, he's essentially what you'd call a toe the line kind of a guy for Christianity, or this the Christian industrial complex that makes money. So here's his steps for how Christians should handle this church shooting. First, we should trust the Lord when things in the world don't make sense. Yes, that's the answer. I don't know why this happened, Lord. Let's trust in you. And sit on our asses and do nothing. Like, Stetzer's essentially just saying, just trust in God, sit on your hands and do nothing. Great, thanks, Ed, because really doing nothing is what's gotten us to this point. That is some amazing advice that you've gone ahead from your throne of money and given us this nugget of wisdom here. Yeah, it's a load of BS. Second, don't grow numb to the terror and the horror of events like this. I'll give him credit for this. Yeah, we don't need to become numb. This doesn't need to be the new normal. This should not grow to be something that we're like, another week, another shooting. And this is on us to change this. And third, Ed offers us this nugget of wisdom. We have to remember that sometimes people die simply for going in the church here and around the world. Yes, I understand this, Ed. Thank you. Thank you for pointing this out, that guess what? People around the world die. And people around the world don't like Christians. This wasn't a Christian persecution act. This was a heinous act from somebody that had mental issues, but mental issues and a gun. And a gun. And so then he goes on to tell us is that, we may think a lot about security in churches today, blah, 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 la, 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 all this other kind of stuff. But what he is not saying, that yes, I know there's a universal church and that God marches on and blah, blah, all that kind of stuff, is this. In America, guess what? This is preventable. We can change this. So, dear Ed Stetzer, if you're writing an article for CNN about what Christians should do, and that doesn't talk about the fact that Christians should mobilize to be able to stop gun violence in America, to mobilize to be able to push forward gun control, because after all, one of the hearts of Christianity is the fact that we need to be people of peace in this world. So when we have evil, when we have legislation that is awry and messed up, that's the place to take action. Let's not have more thoughts and prayers. Let's not have more of these. Let's have a prayer vigil to mourn the loss. Now, it is, I'm going to say this. Yes, you should mourn. Yes, we should mourn. We should mourn. There was a loss of lives. This was a terror attack. This is heinous. This is despicable, disgusting, and it is awful. It is horrible for the families that have to endure the loss of loved ones. I will give you that. Yes, we should mourn, but you have to do something after you mourn. The mourning should lead us towards action because this is a preventable problem. Yes, you mourn, but then you make sure that this doesn't happen again. It doesn't happen again. We have the ability to stop these things from happening. We have the ability to stop these things from being the new normal. This is a preventable issue. And my issue when we have Christian leaders like this writing stuff like this is simply this. When we have fake outrage that tells us to mourn and say God is in charge, that fake outrage steals from our real outrage. We should be outraged. We should be angry. We should be moved to say this should never happen again. Let's take steps to make sure things like this don't happen again. And when you look over just the talk that is coming up, and I'll give you a couple heavy hitters here. The Christian leaders that are now speaking out against the mass shooting at the Texas church. Here's what they're saying. Okay. So the Southern Baptist Convention's president, Stephen Gaines, said this. We're praying for I'm just going to go ahead and give him an accent because I'm just assuming that much. We're praying for the families of those who were killed as well as those who were wounded. We pray that God will lay his merciful hand on healing on all those who have suffered and been injured. May God bring healing and hope to the church and the city. May God bless the police officers serving in that area. And may God prevent further incidents like this throughout our nation in the days to come. Our hearts and prayers are with you. Thanks, Steve Gaines. Thanks. Shut up, really, is what I'm saying. That was a bloated mess of nothing that you're saying. Now, it is a great PR thing to say. It's one of those things that you can say, I'm a leader. Oh, check that off. I went ahead and gave my public service announcement to people. Let's go ahead and talk about Pastor Rob Jeffress from First Baptist Church, Dallas. Also, the guy that quasi mentioned the fact that the protesters in the NFL, they should be thankful that they're not being shot at for protesting, which is really weird coming from a pastor. And he said this. He offered these little butt nuggets of wisdom here. Today's horrific church shooting is every pastor's worst nightmare and is proof of the reality of evil. Although the Bible never diminishes the pain of evil, it does promise that one day when Christ returns, evil will be defeated forever. Until that time, we pray the members of First Baptist Church, Sutherland Springs, will experience the promise of Psalms 34:18. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. But what about the scripture? And I'm majorly paraphrasing where Jesus says, get off your ass and do something. Oh, really? So I'm just going to go ahead and pick his thing apart. Oh, this is every pastor's nightmare and is the proof of the reality of evil. No, the evil is the fact that the NRA is running amok in America and that they have such deep pockets that most of our politicians won't do anything to change gun regulation in our country. That's the reality of evil, my friend. That's the reality of evil. And it's every pastor's worst nightmare. What about the people that, honestly lost family members? Isn't it their worst nightmare? What a bizarre answer to this. And the Lord is close to the brokenhearted. But also, the Lord doesn't want everybody to have guns in America. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for that. And our last little nugget I'll give here, so I can kind of stop with the vitriol, but I've got plenty of it to share. Franklin Graham, my BFF, my snarky crush. Guess what he said? What did this leader that condemns anybody that's outside the religion, anyone that's not white, pray for the families of those killed and the people wounded in the horrific church shootings in Sutherland Springs, Texas today. Really? Prayers? We need to pray for them. No action. Really? That's a total limp answer as a leader right there. Pray for the families. Yes, we should pray for the families. What they're going through is horrific. This is something that no family should ever have to deal with. But again, my main point here is, where's the action? God's not making guns. God's not passing legislation. God doesn't have his pockets deep into the Republican Party. What about that? What about that? And I just walk away from this just befuddled and saying, I really, can you guys miss the point even more? Or as President Trump was calling out, that this is a mental health issue. So this guy was mentally deranged. And I'm not going to argue that this guy had mental health problems because, yes, people that are crazy go out and do this. But what happens when you are normalizing and kind of throwing this in because there's many Americans out there that have legitimate mental health issues that aren't shooting people. So you're putting them in the same camp. Because you have mental health issues does not mean you're a lunatic that is going to go into a place and shoot people. What the president needs to say is, this is an act of terror. This is an absolute horrific act of terror. And we won't stand for this. But because he's white, it's a mental health issue. Because he's white, we're not really going to go there and call him a terrorist. Because he's white, we're not going to try to push for legislation to be able to change the gun laws in America. And that is only scratching the surface of the sickness of the American church right now. And furthermore, the religious right. Because guess what? They are not bold enough, they are not strong enough to call out what this is and what the problem is. Why? Because I'll say this. They love guns more than they love God. Now, I know. But Stuart, you can't judge their hearts. But Stuart, how do you know what's going on within them? You don't have to judge their hearts about this. You have to see the action behind it. I mean, look at this. Look at what's happening. Why aren't we changing the laws? Why aren't we having more gun regulation in America right now? And why isn't the Christian church screaming and moaning and calling out for that? Why? Well, because they know. They want to keep power and they want to pacify their base. And because of that, the church will be the church of erectile dysfunction because they can't get it up, grow a spine, and change things. And until that happens, we're not going to see any change within the church. We're going to continue to see people leave the church. We're going to continue to say that the church is absolutely hypocritical, a church that should call out peace. Because again, I know that these churches want to think Jesus is King Jesus that likes to kick ass and take names, but they don't want to call him the Prince of Peace, which is a name that he's called in the Bible more than once. The Prince of Peace. And in these situations where we love guns more than anything in America, there will be no peace. So remember this, people, in the church and outside the church. When our leaders speak in ways where there is no teeth to their outrage, that's fake outrage. And outrage steals. It steals from the real outrage that we're supposed to have. The real outrage that should lead us to make change and make a difference. But they won't do it because they would rather just run along with the status quo and leave things the way they are. Because guess what? Most of the American Christian leaders in this country just don't care about you. They care about keeping their position and they care about keeping their power. And that is the sad fact about the American church. All of this reminds me of a quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer when he said, "We are not to simply bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheels of injustice. We are to drive a spoke into the wheel itself." I'll say this one more time. We are not simply to bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheels of injustice. We are to drive a spoke into the wheel itself. Injustice will continue to happen, but unless we do something about it, all we can do is help the victims. So do we want to be people that simply just care for the victims, or do we seek to solve the problem? So I say all of that to get to the main point of our hour. Let's talk about another light topic. It's called authoritarianism. Isn't that fun? That's like a fun little thing here. And let's go ahead and just let's have a working definition of this. It's the enforcement or advocacy of strict obedience to authority at the expense of personal freedom. Now, I see this word being thrown around a lot with Trump. And it makes sense. Makes total sense. Because Trump is talking about how he wishes he could push on the Department of Justice, and he wishes he could have his fingers here and here and here and here and here, all the while he's not really doing his own job. But that's kind of the work of an authoritarian. It's somebody that wants to micromanage from the top and have absolute control. And yes, we are living with a president that wants those powers and is deeply frustrated that he does not have those powers. And I mentioned Trump in the midst of this to talk about something else within this kind of a whole sphere of authoritarianism. And I had stumbled on this story because I am friends with Jonathan Martin on Facebook. Ooh, an elusive group. We're so tight and close. But I was actually following this story where Jonathan Martin, he is a Christian author. He's a very prominent anti-Trump Christian author. And this is, I want to say it's about a week ago or so, where he was escorted, which is the nice way of saying it, or essentially thrown off of Liberty University campus. Now, again, if you're a listener of the show, you know there's not a whole lot of love between Snarky Faith and Jerry Falwell Jr. or of people of the like. And yes, we know that liberty is one of the cornerstones for conservative politics, mainly because Falwell Sr. dipped his tip in the political realm and got a taste of it and needed it again and again. Because we've talked about this, we've outlined this before, where Christian leaders that get a taste of power only want more power. It's like a drug, except for it makes you wealthy. So, I don't know. It's like the drug that makes you a drug dealer. I don't know. That analogy. My analogy, I'll admit this. I'll openly admit this. Unlike Sarah Sanders Huckabee, who makes these crazy analogies about the tax cuts, likening them to a bunch of reporters drinking in a bar. Most analogies break down at a certain point. Mine has already broken down. Hers went on for 10 minutes as she was lecturing the press and was wrought with holes. But we're not even going to get into that because that's just a whole load of BS. But yes, so back to Falwell Sr. and Liberty University. And what happened was this. So Jonathan Martin was on campus because he was a guest of the band Johnny Swim. And they were performing a concert there. And again, like their music, no issue with them. And he very quickly was told that he was no longer allowed to be on campus. Now, this wasn't one of those, hey, excuse me, Mr. Martin, can we excuse you from campus? No. Yeah, they had 3 armed policemen, or I guess more like security guards, that were on campus come and tell him that he needed to leave. Because, as it will come out, that Mr. Falwell Jr., what is it with like authoritarians and naming their kids Junior? Again, if you're a junior out there, I'm not saying your dad's an authoritarian. I'm just kind of likening Falwell Jr., Trump and Trump Jr., all these kind of things where you're just kind of making a carbon copy that is probably less savvy or intelligent than the predecessor of a situation. And so here's what Falwell Jr. had initially said. He said, Mr. Martin was not a student, a faculty member, or an employee. And that he was using faculty protocols to ensure safety and order, and that Mr. Martin did not follow these. And he was claiming this was only a publicity stunt because, again, Mr. Martin was going to be holding a kind of a conversation, a prayer vigil, or something like that along the lines for protest, but this is not happening at that moment. And here is like his official statement. It may be possible that Jonathan Martin knew his unauthorized event would ultimately not be permitted to occur on private property of Liberty University, but simply hoped to garner more attention to his cause by having his efforts stopped. So be it. The judgment has been made that it was safer to stop the event before it started than to attempt to turn away an unknown number of people who travel to Liberty University campus. Either option gives Mr. Martin the cause of publicity he apparently seeks. The university cannot be concerned with whether its actions provide additional oxygen to either side of the debate, but rather must be concerned about the safety and security on campus. Because, yes, being able to have an open dialogue, a conversation, kind of a prayer group, that sounds very dangerous and scary. So, yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Faldwell Jr., who cares about safety and security on campus. Mr. Faldwell Jr., who is also encouraged students and allowed students who have concealed carry permits to pack heat on campus. Again, he's really all about safety here. It's all about safety because, again, when you're talking about authoritarians, words, thoughts, ideas, you can't shoot them, so that's really not safe. So I think we're kind of getting into this whole modality that as long as like we're safe if we have a gun and we can shoot something that we don't like, but ideas and thoughts, those are more dangerous. Those are just not okay. And we'll note this that he was actually backstage in the green room hanging out with the band Johnny Swim when like he's escorted off for this. So was he openly causing dissent? Was he wielding guns? Was he doing anything? No, he wasn't. And also, we know this that Falwell Jr. has a major man crush, a major hard-on for President Trump. And we've seen this. We've seen this in his language. We've seen this in his actions. And we have seen this kind of authoritarianism reign supreme in Christian churches, which is why, to some degree, when we talk about this, and I know I make fun of these guys on a regular basis, like the Jim Bakkers, all these other people, this idea that, like, I'm a leader. If you question me, you're bad. If you question me, you are not part of God's will. Which is insane, scary, narcissistic, to say the least. And this is all coming from a campus that claims to have Christian values. Claims to have Christian values. And I don't really recall where Jesus said, if someone doesn't believe like these here, we must get rid of them by any means necessary. No, when it comes to authoritarians, ideas and new thoughts and new ways of thinking about this, they are dangerous. Like we're talking about like McCarthy level danger, because to question authority, to question what the status quo is, whether or not the status quo should be the status quo, that is dangerous. Why? Because it usurps power. And to be an authoritarian, you need to have absolute power and no one needs to question it. That's what we've seen in so many third world countries, or whatever you call Russia right now. You know, if you speak out against the government, you may just disappear. Which I know is Trump's wet dream for America. Let me do what I want to do, and if you don't like it, you'll just go away. Don't worry, it'll be the best ever. No, I mean, I don't even know where we're moving in this way. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to kind of move this back in to talking about pastors in the local church. Now, I don't want to sit and focus too much on Trump because, again, if you're a listener of this show and you've continued to listen this far in this episode, you're mainly nodding, yes, 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 he's terrible. Yes, 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 he wants absolute power. Yes, 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 his power is way too much for somebody of such little intellect. I mean, it's really hard for him to hold on to his power with his tiny little hands. That's kind of how it works. And in this age, like I've seen this because late night comics, I feel like have become the prophets of this age because laughter and comedy ends up being the release valve for what we are dealing with. But guess what? Late night comics are not talking about pastors that have too much power in the local churches. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples. And these are personal examples. So you may ask yourself, so Stuart, what do you know about the local church? What do you know about pastors with too much power? What do you know about micromanaging and narcissistic people? Oh, sit down. Let's have a little chat. I remember, this is years back, I was working for a large church out on the West Coast. Youth pastor, or youth director, because there could only be one pastor in the church. That's kind of how they operated. And yes, they were part of a of a larger denomination out there. But as soon as I got hired, they were working to pull themselves out of that denomination because the pastor didn't like the fact that he had other people over him, which, again, I was in my 20s. I didn't think anything of it. And I kind of like always sticking it to the man, whoever the man is. And so I was like, oh, it's kind of cool. This guy's like, he's blazing his own trail. He's doing his own thing. Little did I know that he was simply doing this so he could do what he wanted to do unchecked. Now, this is a guy, which again, when I was hired, didn't know about, but found out within months of being hired. Father founded the church, and the son was kind of the associate pastor of the time, which again is why they got rid of the whole pastor notation eventually in time to where there's only one pastor, there's only one in power. And this guy actually worked to overthrow his own dad. Like the church his dad started, this guy overthrew his dad so he could take over the church in a small, loving coup, because coups are always fun. Who doesn't love a good coup? Unless you're the guy that's being overthrown. And so, yes, so I step into this situation, start working there, and begin to realize, oh my gosh, this place is pretty dang sick. Most of the employees have been abused verbally or spiritually the whole time. And most of them have learned through their abuse that if I want to keep my job here, I keep my head down and say nothing, which is a bad recipe for adding Stuart into the mix. Now, I will go ahead and tell you, in my youth, I wasn't as cultured as I was now. Or I love it that I'm saying, yes, I can't even pronounce English when I'm talking about how cultured I am in the moment. So take that for what it's worth. But no, so back in my youth, yes, I did not know the way systems of power worked. And so me, being a person that thought about being respectful, when I would see these things going on, I would take it privately to the pastor, which again, I am very much that idea that you praise people publicly and criticize them privately if you're in some sort of an organization. And so I would have several meetings with the pastor. Man, like this is going on. Like, how do you feel about this? Like, this kind of feels like a little wonky here. This feels like a little. And little did I know, me being able to express openly, which I was told I could, which was a trap, was limiting my days of being there. Because someone that wants ultimate authority, what do they want? They want yes men. And I have seen this time and time and time again in churches that I have either attended or I have worked for, where you have the pastor operating as a CEO type. And a CEO type where, again, let's go ahead and say this, most pastors could not hack it as a CEO. But they like to think of themselves of kind of being the CEO of a business. Now, most of them will not admit it because, again, I'm a religious leader. I'm leading them spiritually down the right path. But again, it goes back to most churches operate as businesses. And I've seen this again and again across multitude of denominations. Again, I bounced around. Grew up Southern Baptist. I actually worked for a Foursquare church, which is more charismatic for a couple years. I've worked for nonprofit Christian organizations, and I've worked for Methodist churches. So I've gone Baptist, Methodist, charismatic. I've kind of done like a lot of the spectrum there, and I see the same patterns. Rarely have I seen people that operate their leadership pool out of something that looks like Jesus. Because when you look at the modality of Jesus, Jesus was a servant leader. He led by doing. He led by showing. He didn't lead by micromanaging the disciples. He didn't lead by using his position of power to push on other people. No, he led by example. And his example was to be a servant to others. And so when you continue to see this as a recurring pattern on both coasts that I've lived on, both coasts that I've worked on, this begins to be a problem. Where if you are in a church and you cannot question the pastor, that begins to be a problem. Now, I'm also saying this, like, I'm not also calling for people, even though I felt like doing this on occasion, to be able to actually stand up in the middle of a service and challenge a pastor. Never done that. And I don't recommend that. because there's a time and a place for being able to challenge people of power. But when you actually pull someone aside or say, "Hey, can I have a meeting with you?" This was a little troublesome. And at those moments where you're expressing how you feel, where you see the fallout of it afterwards, where they begin to get people that kind of push you out or call you into question. Like when you're just saying, "Hey, I know you were saying this, but I'm really curious about like how does this gel with Jesus?" Those kind of questions where no, I'm not going ahead and saying, "Oh my God, you're a heretic. Oh my gosh, you were drunk on power." Didn't mean I'm not thinking it, but I didn't say that. But when you see that happen to where you actually ask people honest questions in my hopes was for dialogue, but the result ends up being that the pastor starts turning against you, starts picking apart what you're doing, starts using other people in the church to pick apart what you're doing because that is an act of submission. And we talked about this last week. And if you want to listen to the episode, it's on our website, www.snarkyfaith.com, where we talked about Henry Weinstein and Trump and this whole idea of how power corrupts. But we continue to see this pattern in the churches to where everything is hunky-dory as long as you are completely fine and with what the pastor is doing and saying. It's completely fine as long as you don't ask questions or challenge them. Now, again, I caution you saying that there's a time and a place for being able to ask questions. There's a time and a place for challenging people that I feel like are appropriate. But to see this time and time again, this is a problem. Because guess what? Ultimately, if you are, because I'd compared pastors to like a CEO type mentality earlier, and like a CEO does answer to his shareholders. They do answer to, in a certain sense, the employees. If you're seeing a huge vacuum of employees like leaving because the work environment is that bad. But churches look at people differently. And I think I've mentioned this before. It was a while back when I'd gone through some training where it was teaching people about how to plant a church, how to start a church, how to get this off the ground. And they referred to in this lesson, I kid you not, as people that you use to build your church as scaffolding. And I asked the guys, like, what do you mean scaffolding? Oh, scaffolding, the stuff that you use to kind of build the outside of a building, but when the building's finally finished, you take the scaffolding away and it leaves. You need to be able to see that there's people that are going to come and go, and they'll essentially just be scaffolding to you. And for me, that was horrific because guess what? Every one of those people that you're calling scaffolding have a name. They have a story. They matter to God. And so as much as pastors would like to run people out of the church and only have people in the church that are like-minded, this is a very problematic thing when you begin to tie this into the kingdom of God. Because where does authoritarianism stand in the kingdom of God? Well, okay, let's go to Scripture. Let's go to the Bible. Okay, so God is God and Lord of all. So where does that leave the pastor? Again, I return to look at the mold, the make, the teachings, the actions of Jesus. Jesus was a servant leader. Now, do we see a lot of these pastors? Let's talk about Faldwell Jr. I don't even really, they may say he's a reverend. He doesn't act as it. He just acts like an a-hole that runs a very conservative Christian school. But even on a smaller level, let's just talk about pastors in churches. Do they act like they have been appointed to a position to be able to serve God and serve their people? Or is this really, I've been given the power to rule? And that's very different. And we see this mode even throughout the Old Testament where you will have people, and this is going way back. Let's talk about like the time of like King David, David and Goliath, the guy that like killed the giant. And so there was a time back in Israel's history where you had the prophets. The prophets were kind of the mouthpieces of God. And you have this prophet Samuel, and the people are calling out, oh, we need a king because everybody else has a king. We want to be like everybody else. We want to be ruled like every other nation that's around us. We want to have a king. And God continued to tell like Samuel, no, you don't need a king. Like, I'm God. I'm in charge. I'm really just what you need. And they're like, no. And eventually Samuel's just kind of threw his hands up in the air and was like, whatever. And then God allows them to have a king. Now, this king, which is Saul, ends up not being what they wanted. And then it leads to eventually King David, which comes in, and King David with all of his flaws, still leads majorly like a servant. And at the heart of Christian leadership is the attitude of serving around you. Now, one of the reasons that people don't do this, and you may say, Stuart, it's in the Bible. Stuart, Jesus talks about this. Stuart, we've seen other people like David in the Bible. Why don't more Christian leaders act like that? Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. I'll tell you why. Because it's not sexy. Humility, it's not sexy. Being a servant, not sexy. Being a CEO, oh, yeah. I say something and the people tremble. Being president, oh, I say something and they do what I want to do. Now, that, to many people, is sexy. Now, is it Christian? No. Is it what God wants? No. Now, I can expect that in corporations. I can maybe even expect that in Christian universities. But in the church that is supposedly the bride of Christ, that is supposed to be this taste of heaven on earth, which really just tastes like you've been like wafting too much of a porta potty. That church that we have here in America, no. The church in America is not a taste of heaven. It's not a taste of God's kingdom. And it's not anything that remotely resembles what God had wanted for the church. And that is a problem. When you have churches that only want people that are like-minded, when you have churches that their borders are so rigid and harsh that you must look a certain way, speak a certain way, talk a certain way, that's not what God intended for the church. God intended a church that had porous boundaries. People could come and leave. Where the church was so open that it looked like something that was part of the community. A church that cared more about the suffering and those that were hurting in the community than they did about their budgets and about a building program. And about, we've got to make sure we're getting everybody to sign pledge cards because it's that time of year. The church is never supposed to be self-serving. The church is only supposed to be self-sacrificial. When you look at the early church in Acts, what the church looked like in the earliest of early churches, in the book of Acts, Jesus goes, whoop, peace out, I'm out of here. You guys are the church. You go ahead and take it. The Holy Spirit's with you. You guys go have a ball. And the church was people that came together. They broke bread. They fed the poor. They helped those that were in need. And they shared what they had. They did. Possessions, they shared it amongst each other, what they had. Why? Because that's what God wanted them to do. But now we see churches that, like I'd mentioned at the beginning of the hour, are now worried about, we need to have security guards, armed guards. We need to have doors that have locks on them. We need to make sure that there are signs outside saying no skateboarding around here because that is an issue with the youth in this area. We don't want them hanging around in our parking lot after hours because after all, we can get sued. After 9/11, I'd run into this guy because this is early in my Christian career. I'd run into this guy, and he was actually a security specialist for churches. And so as I met him, he told me, I was like, okay, I'll bite. Go ahead and tell me what you do. And he runs into this long diatribe of, well, and especially when you think about the shooting that happened in Texas, he's like, well, first of all of our congregations, the problem behind them are everyone's back is turned to the pastor. The pastor's the only person that can see who comes in the church. And so I was like, okay, so what do you do about this? Just really humoring him and halfway curious what a church security expert means. And so I'm just kind of letting him ramble on about this, but he just starts talking about how, yes, we need to have people that are kind of like plainclothes cops or plainclothes security in the church, but that, if anything gets out of hand, that, they'll start mowing people down as the need be, or as the Spirit leads them to shoot people. And again, my wife always tells me this. I have to make this kind of just service announcement here. You are listening to a show called Snarky Faith, so realize I am speaking with a very thick level of sarcasm. Now let me carry on. And so he talked about, and he just kept talking and talking and talking about all these things churches can do to make sure they are almost like this kind of like secure bunker for this Christian militia to exist and worship God, which there's so much hypocrisy, and I don't even want to dig out all he was saying. But the one thing that I was left with when I was listening to this was fear, 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 fear. Pastors don't want to give up power. Pastors don't want to be servants. Pastors don't want to be humble because they fear giving up power. Now, they're willing to give up power if they're getting people to do jobs around the church, right? That's called delegating. I've been told that before. It's called delegating. You get people in the church to do a bunch of the work. I'm not talking about that. Honestly, giving up power. Honestly, having an open forum and an open table, whereas the church has no hierarchy, where the church body, as it's meant to be, does not have one person that is elevated above all others. It is meant to be a community of people that come together, that love one another, that love their community, and that do all they can to help the people in the church and help the people outside the church. It's meant to be a flat line of hierarchy. Is that what we have now? Gosh, no, because that's not sexy. And no one wants to sign up to be a servant leader. But being a servant leader is absolutely essential if you want to be able to follow Jesus, if you want to go to seminary, if you want to become a pastor. Now, I'm saying it's essential if you want to live into the gospel that Jesus talked about. Is it essential to go to seminary and become a pastor and be a servant leader? No, it's not. The system we have here in America, it'll reward you fine. The higher you rise and the more that you separate yourself from the common folk, because after all, you are a reverend or a pastor, and that title brings with it such prestige, and it's all a load of it. It's been one title that I have that I have actually run from my whole life. I don't want to be known as that. I don't want to be a pastor. I don't want to be a reverend or minister. Why? Because guess what? As soon as I say that, it separates me from everybody else. I want to be in and amongst the people. I want to hear what they have to say. I don't want them to hold back their truth or how messed up they are. Because we see that too in churches where everyone wants to live up to this ideal of the pastor who has and again, I'm speaking of this in very man-centric terms because that's most of the pastors in America. The pastor that is this wonderful patriarch of the church, and he has a dutiful wife and his beautiful, wonderful children. If only we could live up to that. Oh my gosh, then Jesus would be happy with us. Yeah, that's not true. The real life happens in the dirtiness of life. And the church should be an open place for the dirtiness of life, to be able to wrestle through it, to help others, and to say, guess what? I screwed up. I'm not perfect, and I want to be better. How can you help me? The role of a pastor should be something that says, I don't have it all figured out. Can you help me figure this out too? Too often have I seen guys that come directly out of seminary, again, in their 20s, and they're leading a congregation. The first time that they've led anyone in their entire life. And they're instantly expected to be an expert. No 20-year-old is an expert in anything. And they're the expert over people that have so much more life experience than they do. See, these kind of systems lead to problems with authoritarianism. They lead to problems with Henry Weinstein issues. They lead to problems with abuse of power. They lead to problems that give us people like Jerry Falwell Jr., where it's my way or the highway. Ultimately, what I'm saying here is the church needs to serve the community. They need to serve the people that are in the walls of the church as well, too. But they have to do it as a servant. They have to do it in humility. And until you see that, if you're going to a church where you don't feel like you can actually be able to speak your mind or ask questions, where you feel like you have to fake it on a Sunday, that's not home to you. You need to find a place where you can be yourself. Because once you can be yourself, that's where God can actually work with you. And once you can be yourself, you can actually be yourself with others, where you can help them to be better and they can help you to be better. That was the vision God had for a church that could heal the world. But that's not the church that we have today. Sadly, that's not. but it doesn't mean you can't change it. Doesn't mean you can't change it. So that's all I got this hour. Thank you so much for being a part of this journey. Thank you so much for being a part of Snarky Faith. And a reminder as we end this broadcast that you can catch us on podcast at www.snarkyfaith.com. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter and email me. Send me messages. I love them. Tell me I'm great. Tell me I'm horrible. I don't care. I love to hear it all. And our wonderful listeners send us in different articles they want me to talk about. And guess what? 99% of the time, they end up on the air. So questions at snarkyfaith.com. If you want to get in contact with me, I'd love to talk to you. But that's all the time I got this hour, and I will see you guys again next week. I'm out of here. Peace.
WCOM is listener-supported community radio, and Snarky Faith is only possible through our sponsors. Aqueduct Conference Centre was established in 1978 as a peaceful destination for small group meetings, special events, conferences, retreats, and weddings. For more information, go to www.aqueductcc.com. We are also sponsored by Lumen. Lumen, a spiritual community of seekers, sojourners, question askers, doubters, and skeptics, is a collective of fellow travelers that embrace the truth that all life is sacred, hope is real, and tomorrow can be better than today. All are welcome. You can find more information at www.lumencommunities.com.